Now we'll want to blur this a little bit because we don't want it to be really sharp, otherwise it's not going to look natural. So at this point we'll go ahead and save a copy of our painting. I'm going to go -5, and the reason why we're doing that is because we're going to merge all of these tree layers. So I'm going to collapse the tree and do Control E to merge all the layers into a single layer. And then we want to make sure that preserve transparency is not on, and you want to make sure the composite method is set to multiply. And we will select the blur brush, and we'll zoom in a little bit to the trunk. We're going to blur the trunk first, just along the edge here to soften the edge. So I'm just going to kind of paint over it. I'm not going to worry about any of the larger branches yet, just the main part of the trunk here. Something like this looks good. And this helps just to make everything a little bit out of focus, because these digital brushes have a habit of being too sharp sometimes, which doesn't look very natural. Now we want to zoom out and blur some of these edge branches here so that they look like they're a little more distant. What this is doing is this is giving the tree a sense of three-dimensionality, because otherwise it would look kind of flat. So if your eyes were focusing on the main part of the tree, the further away branches would be a little more out of focus. So I'm going to use a big blur brush, and I'm going to paint just along the edges of the tree, like so. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to use a smaller brush to paint in between some of the bigger branches so that it gives some of these smaller branches in the background a sense of being out of focus. And you can kind of just do this here and there wherever you think you want to. You want to avoid blurring too much, because your tree will look unnatural if you do. So just do some of these little background ones, and don't worry about doing anything in the center really. We'll zoom out to evaluate how we're looking, and I think that looks much better. Now let's add some objects here in the corners just to kind of make the composition look a little bit better. We'll add a new layer, make it a multiply composite method, and we will change the name to side bushes. We'll select black. We'll take the detail oils brush, and we'll draw in some similar kind of forking tapered strokes here, starting down, pressing firmly, and then lifting my pen up quickly off the canvas as I make the stroke. This will just be some little grass or sticks or trees. Who knows what this stuff is? Just some visual interest off in the corner here. Now let's blur these a little bit to put them slightly out of focus. We will use the blur blender for that and make it pretty big, and just blur it out so it looks like it's kind of maybe more in the foreground or the background. So now that we have most of our objects in the composition, we can start to play around with the lighting a little bit to bring everything together. So I'm going to create a new layer, and let's call it glow. We'll make it a screen composite method, and we'll select the glow brush, and let's sample this orange color from the sky, make it a little bit darker. We'll use a pretty big glow brush. Let's move the glow above the horizon. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make it look like there's some light kind of spilling over this branch and over the horizon a little bit. So I'm just going to paint kind of a tight kind of circle. I'm just going to tap in and paint in some light here, like so. Now it really makes this background branch look like it's kind of going off into the distance. Now let's also add a vignette. I always like to add these vignettes because they help draw the focus into the center of the piece. So we'll zoom out to where we can see our whole canvas here. We'll pick kind of a dark purple gray, and we'll use the digital airbrush for this with a pretty big airbrush. We'll start by vignetting the top a little bit here. Make our brush a little bit smaller, and then we'll vignette the sides using this kind of radial gradient. See, I'm having it kind of curve, so it makes it look like the light is kind of in the center here, emanating out radially. If you do it too dark, you can always turn down the opacity of that layer. I think that looks pretty good. And then at this point, let's do a check of all of our values in the piece, because you want your piece to look good in black and white as well as color. So we'll create a new layer. We'll call this value check. And we'll make this a color composite method. And then we want to select black for our color, and we'll want to fill with current color. What that's going to do is that's going to temporarily make our artwork black and white so that we can see how it looks in black and white. Now you want there to be a good balance of light and dark and everything in between. So if it looks good in black and white, it's probably going to look good in color as long as all your colors are right. So I always like to look at things this way. This is a little tip I learned from Karen Bonacker. We'll turn the value check layer off so we can see our piece with color again. And at this point, if you need to, you can go to the sky layer and add layers above it to lighten or darken it. So we'll do a lighten layer and we'll do a darken layer. Now for the darken, you'll want that to be a multiply composite method, and for the lighten, you'll want that to be a screen. This just makes sure that everything blends naturally. So for instance, we could go to the lighten layer, we could take a light yellow orange like this, and the digital airbrush, and we could go through and we could lighten some of this area here to make it a bit brighter. You could add some more red orange if you wanted to brighten the sky more, make it more intense. Really don't want to go too overboard with this, and you only need to do this if it's necessary. Like if you notice that when you do your value check here that it's too light or too dark. See what I'm adding here, it's making it almost way too bright, and I'm kind of losing some detail. If I look at it with on and off, you can see, so I probably don't want to overdo that lightening too much. We could go to the darken, and we can pick a darker purple kind of color, and we could use the same digital airbrush to darken if some of these areas are too light. You can also turn down the opacity of the layer to just make it a more subtle change. Now if we do our value check again, you can see that looks a little bit better, I think. It kind of helped balance out all of the lighting. Now the last thing that we'll do as our little finishing touch is we will add a flock of birds flying over here in the corner, and for that we're going to use a special nozzle that we have in our nozzle library here called Farbirds. So if this is collapsed, you can just double click on it to open it, tap to select the birds. You'll have to use an image hose brush to paint with an image hose nozzle. This one recommends we use spray size P angle W. That's that second brush here. And I recommend that you create a new layer for your birds, put it above your dark clouds layer but behind your tree layer. That way if you put birds near your tree, they'll go behind them. We'll make a layer called birds. We'll make it a multiply composite method. And you'll want to just use your mouse to click, because that'll just make one bird at a time rather than a whole bunch. We don't want to make too many. So I'm going to click and I get a bird. If the bird's too big, you can make it smaller by making your brush smaller. So I'm going to use the left bracket key to make some smaller birds. Put those in. And then I'm going to use the right bracket key to make some bigger birds, just by hitting the right bracket key a couple times. I'm going to hit it a few more times to make even bigger birds. So what I'm doing is, as I'm going into the foreground, I'm making my birds bigger and bigger. That's giving a sense of distance. There we go. And if you wanted to, you could even move this whole flock around to really position it where you want it. I think we'll go right here. That way the eye kind of goes in between the tree and this bush, kind of flows up in this direction. And then we will blur these birds a little bit using the blur brush. You don't want to blur them too much, just very lightly. And the ones in the background should be more blurry than the ones in the foreground. Now we can give them a little bit more distance if we tint the background ones, the sky color a little bit. So we'll turn on Preserve Transparency, select the digital airbrush, select this light yellow orange, and then just paint over the most distant birds with a little bit of that orange. And what that does is that makes them look like they're in the background more than the ones that are in the foreground. And we'll zoom out and see how we're looking. I think at this point we have a nice finished piece, and we can go ahead and sign it and save it to submit in the class form. So we'll do a save as. We'll save it as 6 or whichever number you're on, and then we will do a drop all to flatten all of our layers into a single layer, and we'll save it again, doing save as. Save it as another copy, and this will be our final copy here. Now it's up to you if you want to sign it. You could create a new layer for your signature, and you could use the scratchboard tool, for instance, and you could sign it. In this case, I'm not going to sign this one, but if you want to, you can. So let's save a couple versions. One is going to be for printing, and the other one is going to be for the web and for submitting as your final assignment. So for the print version, we'll go to File, Save As. We'll select TIFF as our file format. It's a good format for printing. And we'll change the file name to Lesson 1 Print. Go to Save. And then we will go to Canvas Resize to make this a little bit smaller. You want to make sure that this box that says Constrained File Size is not checked. Then we want to change our measurement to inches. We'll want to change our resolution first to 72, and then both of these options will stay the same. We'll go to OK, and now we have a smaller version that's more suitable for the web. We'll go to File, Save As. We will call this one Lesson 1 Web. It will be a PNG file format because that's a good file format for the web, and then we'll go to Save. This small web PNG version is the version that I want you to post as your final assignment for Lesson 1. So there you go. We have a finished painting of a sunset and a dead tree and a nice flock of birds flying through it. I hope you had fun, and stay tuned for Lesson 2.